You ever hear about a man born into a place where bloodlines looped in on themselves like a noose, a man born without the ability to scream? Not from shock or trauma, but because he entered this world without a tongue. His hands, with 7 fingers in total, 3 on the left, 4 on the right, were curled inward, shriveled and useless. He was never given a proper name, just a nickname whispered like a curse, the Crawl. And if you're hearing this, you've stepped off the map, because this story isn't found in libraries. It lives in whispers passed between broken families in regions so forgotten the census stopped counting. Tucked deep into the hills of eastern Tennessee, beyond the reach of telephone poles or any road you trust, there once stood a house that looked less built than vomited up by the land itself. In 1942, inside a home of rotted wood and relatives who didn't keep track of who was kin, the Crawl was born. Some say his mother was also his sister. Others claim she wasn't human at all, just the last functional mind in a family sinking into madness. Doctors never saw him. The town never knew he existed. But the holler did, and it listened. People swear he made noises anyway, throat deep, wet sounds, like an animal trying to imitate speech. And when they say he had no tongue, they don't mean it was missing. They mean it was never there to begin with, just a smooth slab of pink meat where a life of language should have formed. His fingers were bent like twigs left too long in water. But what haunted the old women who spoke of him wasn't his appearance. It was the way the forest fell completely silent when he walked by. They say he lived longer than anyone expected, perhaps too long. Long enough to see every member of his bloodline either vanish or rot from the inside out. No one ever taught him shame, but somehow he seemed to wear it like a weight sewn into his spine. You have to understand, this wasn't some horror story stitched together for entertainment. This was a real man. And the more you learn about him, the more you realize he should have never existed. They say his grandfather built the house with bare hands and rusted nails, not out of pride, but out of paranoia. Every window was small, every door low enough to force you to bow as you entered. The house was a cage designed to keep eyes out and blood in. The Crawl was born into silence, but he wasn't alone. There were others, 3 uncles, 2 aunts, and a mother who aged twice as fast as she should have. No birth certificates, no school records, just a family that fed on each other's memories until they forgot where one person ended and another began. Neighbors, if you could call them that, would sometimes hear guttural thumps from the hills at night, as if something large and limping moved just outside the tree line. Once, a boy hunting raccoons found a pile of bones arranged in a perfect spiral. Most thought they were goat bones, but one had a gold filling still wedged in the molar. No goat ever wore gold. It was in this nest of confusion that the Crawl became something else. He didn't speak, but he watched from the corners, from behind trees. Children who wandered too close to the property line would return pale and shaken, whispering about a man with no eyes, not blind, just empty, as if the sockets had collapsed inward from lack of use. But that was the thing, everyone saw something different. Some swore his mouth stretched ear to ear like torn skin. Others claimed he had no mouth at all. Hallucinations, probably, but every account ended the same: I felt like I was being remembered. In '67, a sheriff tried to investigate. He drove up with 2 deputies and a pistol full of bravado. What came back was the car, empty, still running. No sign of struggle, just a string of footprints leading into the woods and none coming out. Official reports say they ran off. But the sheriff's wife swore he'd left his wallet behind, something he never did. That's the problem with stories like this: they fray, they warp. But if you sit still long enough, the truth crawls back. It was after that disappearance that the townspeople started using the term the Crawl more seriously, not as a nickname, but like it was a position, a role passed down in shadows, as if the man wasn't born deformed, but chosen to be that way. By the 1970s, the house had collapsed inward, as if even the land rejected what had lived there. But the Crawl remained. Neighbors who dared walk near the edge of his property reported catching glimpses, just flashes of a figure sitting motionless among the debris. No roof, no walls, just a man-shaped absence barely visible through the trees. He never moved. He never waved, but you could feel it, the stare, like a nail pressing into your spine. There were rumors, of course, that he survived on raw animals, that he somehow bred with something else in the woods, that he was cursed, born as punishment for the family's sins. The local preacher called him a demon in human skin. But there was no proof, only a quiet fear, the kind that makes you cross yourself when you're alone, even if you've never believed in anything before. One girl, 17 at the time, decided to prove it was all superstition. She brought a Polaroid and crept up the hill in daylight. Her boyfriend waited at the base, engine running. She never came back down. A week later, the sheriff found her camera on a stump near the property line. Only one picture had developed. It was mostly just trees, but in the far right corner, crouched low behind a fallen beam, was something pale, almost human, except for the fingers. Long wrong. The image was buried in police evidence, but copies circulated in whispers. It became a rite of passage among teenage boys in the area: find the photo, stare at it long enough, and see if it stares back. Some swore the image changed over time. The figure crept closer. The shadows shifted. A trick of the light, most likely, but some swore on their fathers' graves that the photo bled when touched. People moved away. Families sold their land for pennies. The roads crumbled, overgrown with roots and silence. By the 80s, that part of the county was wiped off official maps. Not condemned, not restricted, just erased. And yet, hunters still spoke of sightings. And sometimes, late at night, you'd hear it, a sound like wet paper tearing. Not a voice, not an animal, something in between. Because the crawl didn't die. He never left. He just waited. You'd think someone like that, disfigured, isolated, half-myth, would vanish quietly. But in 1992, a construction crew unknowingly disturbed the hill. A development project greenlit miles away in the state capital had its blueprints mixed up. A private company bulldozed a path up toward the old property, planning a cell tower. Within 48 hours, 3 workers quit with no explanation. One was found later that week walking barefoot down a highway, his hands packed with dirt and fingernails torn clean off. He never spoke again. The project was abandoned. Local officials blamed budget cuts, but the men who had gone up that slope refused to say what they saw, only that something was still alive up there, still moving, still watching. One man, a welder, scribbled a single line in grease pencil across the inside of his trailer wall: "He doesn't eat, he remembers." That year, a journalist from Knoxville named Aaron Marley tried to write a feature story, Appalachian Decay, Forgotten Families, the usual angle. She interviewed locals, read the whispers, even tracked down the girl's Polaroid. But she made one mistake: she went up alone. Her final recording was recovered from a melted cassette found in the glove box of her burnt-out sedan. The engine was still intact. No crash, no explosion, just fire. Experts said it was spontaneous combustion, but on the tape, you can hear it, her voice shaking, wind howling, and underneath it all, barely audible, scratching, not like an animal, like bone on bark. Then silence, and then something wet, breathing almost, no words, just presence. The tape ends with Aaron gasping, whispering a final phrase: "His mouth is open, but there's nothing inside." The fire marshal never filed a proper report. The ashes were buried, and Aaron's name disappeared from the newsroom within a month. Her family stopped talking about her. Friends deleted her photos. It was as if she'd never existed. You see, that's what the crawl does. He doesn't just end lives. He erases lines. Memory, history, language, they unravel around him like rope dipped in acid. And if you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments what you would have done if this was your bloodline. Because if you trace your roots far enough, you might find soil that should have stayed untouched. Some say he was the last of them. That when the bloodline folded in on itself for the final time, it produced something that wasn't human anymore, but wasn't anything else either. The crawl was less a man and more a consequence, a punishment that kept walking. But there's one story that still floats around among the oldest folks, told only once, then never again. It comes from a nurse, an elderly woman now, who worked night shifts at a long-term care home 3 counties over. In 2004, they took in a patient brought by 2 silent men with government IDs. No name, no records, no insurance. The order was simple: keep him comfortable. She said the man was small, hunched, with limbs too short and fingers curled like dried worms. No tongue, no teeth, no vocal cords. But still he moved, not randomly, with intention, slowly, as if each motion carried the memory of generations. And then there were the things he knew. He would sit by the window and turn his head at exactly 3:17 a.m. every night for weeks, until one night a patient in the next room died at 3:17 exactly. He'd trace shapes on the walls with his fingers. Spirals, always spirals. The cleaning staff painted over them every morning, but the next night they'd return, slightly larger, slightly deeper. By week 3, the paint had begun to bubble. The nurse said she once sat with him during a storm. No lights, just thunder. And in that moment, she swore he was listening to her thoughts. That her worst childhood memories rose unbidden, flashes of shame, fear, guilt, until she could barely breathe. He just sat there, blinking, breathing through the hole where a tongue should have been. When she asked him, trembling, "What are you?" he lifted his hand slowly and tapped the window 3 times. Outside was a tree, dead, split down the middle by lightning. The next morning, he was gone. No discharge paperwork, no trace in the system. The room had been emptied, bed stripped, spirals gone, as if he'd never been there. But she kept one thing, the pillowcase, a soft flannel with a blood stain, not from a wound, but shaped almost perfectly like a hand. A hand with 7 fingers. And since then, she never speaks of the mountains. She won't even look at maps. Because some things don't just die out, they wait. You'd think folklore dies with time. But in places like this, Appalachia's bone-thin ridges and hollowed-out veins, it furs instead, not as bedtime stories, but as warnings passed in glances, in silences, in what's not said. Because deep down they know, the cruel was never a man. He was a scar in the shape of one. One final story lingers, and it's the one people refuse to write down. A park ranger, new to the area, decided to map old mining trails near the abandoned property line. His GPS pinged him stationary for 3 hours, then blinked out entirely. They found him 3 days later, barely alive, eyes wide open and unblinking, seated upright against a tree with both hands jammed into the soil. When medics pulled him out, he didn't speak for 12 hours. Then he said just one sentence, "There's another one. Not a man. Not the crawl. Another one." The doctors dismissed it as shock, but they couldn't explain the pattern scratched into his forearms, long spirals that bled but never scabbed. Nor could they explain why, even in sedation, he kept trying to fold his fingers inward, breaking bones in the process, trying to mimic that unnatural 7-fingered curl. If the crawl was born of generations of decay, then maybe something learned from him. Or through him. That's the idea that haunts the locals more than anything else. He wasn't the end. He was a door, a signal, a rotten prayer spoken into blood and land until the land itself started praying back. And now, decades later, people still whisper. Hikers who get lost in the ridges report hearing wet clicking sounds like molars grinding, echoing off the bark. Trail cams catch blurred silhouettes too tall, too thin, arms dangling too low. Hunters return without memory of the last 48 hours, and children in nearby towns are born with deformities not seen in 100 years. No one connects it officially, but the families know. They all moved west, left behind what they called bad land. But the land didn't forget them. Because somewhere out there, the crawl still waits. Maybe not in flesh. Maybe not as one man, but as a pattern, an inheritance passed not through blood, but through silence. The final piece of this story isn't found in records or passed down through old photographs. It's buried in an unmarked grave behind a church that no longer holds service because no one dares walk through its doors. Locals say the preacher who built it went mad, started speaking in riddles, said he was listening to the soil. That the dirt beneath the chapel was whispering stories not in words but in shapes, spirals again, drawn in ash, burned into the wooden pews, etched into his skin. They found him face down in the baptismal font, water gone, replaced by blood. His hands were clawed and stiff, fingers broken inward, trying to hide something in his palms. When the coroner pried them open, he found only rocks, 7 exactly, smooth, small, and wet, though there had been no rain in weeks. No funeral was held. The body was buried fast, quiet, not out of shame, but fear. Fear that whatever had touched him was still nearby, waiting for another soul to listen too closely, to believe too much. It's easy to dismiss all this as legend, backwards madness, inbred hysteria. But legends don't erase maps. They don't steal names from hospital records. They don't cause grown men to gnaw through their own tongues in padded rooms, screaming about the mouth that remembers. See, the truth is, something did live out there. Whether it was a man, or the echo of a man, or something twisted into the shape of a man, we'll never fully know. But we let it happen. We turned away. We ignored the rot, and it grew in the walls, in the blood, in the names we forgot to bury properly. So now, if you ever find yourself driving through eastern Tennessee and the road grows too quiet, if your radio dies, if your GPS spins in circles, if the forest begins to lean inward like it's breathing, turn around. Do not go looking for the house. Do not follow the spirals. Do not answer the silence. Because silence is not safety. Silence is what he hears through. And somewhere out there, he still remembers your name. He's not coming for you. You've already arrived.